Okay, so as Mr. Mendez said, it's a chance for anyone to ask any questions they would like. We'll all do our best to answer them. If they're too hard, I'll pass them to Dr. Sace or Bishop Sproxton. And there are microphones around. There's someone here right at the start, so you just need to wait for a microphone to come up. Right up the front here, someone from Servite College. The principal's looking a bit nervous in case the question's a bit tricky. Just say your name so we know who you are.
My name is Cecilia, and
Hi,
I'm
Cecilia.
from Servite College. And my question is, how are we able to educate and incorporate the students of our schools that are non-Catholics about the Catholic faith without making it seem as if we're forcing our beliefs onto them?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Thanks, Cecilia. So, the first thing that pops into my mind when you say that is something that I try and also think about in my role as the Archbishop. And in a sense, the role is the same for any Christian. How do we share our faith or let people know that we're people of faith without sort of beating them over the head with it or trying to force them? Pope Francis, and before him Pope Benedict, and before him Pope John Paul II, all used to say something that I think is pretty important and I've thought a lot about. They said that the role of the church, which means the role of any of us who are part of the church, in relation to our faith, is to propose but never to impose. And I think that's really worth thinking about. As Christian people, we would believe that we have a great story to tell people. But it's a story to tell people. It's not something to as I say, belt people over the head with. So I think my main thing would be, and everyone would have to think about how I would do this in my own local context, but we share our faith. We're not ashamed to hide it, but we're not trying to force anybody to believe what we believe, because that's not what faith is like. Faith is something that catches your attention or catches your interest, and you think about it and you think, gee, I wonder why that person behaves like that, or I'm impressed with what that person said. I'd like to know a bit more about that. But if you come in, boots and all, trying to force people to believe what you believe, all you're going to do is put them off anyway. So I think I'd say a couple of things. One is try to understand your faith as well as you can. And we can all get weird ideas about our faith, and we can all get sort of a bit overzealous about our faith. We've been given this gift. The reason why we've been given it is because God wants us to share it, not to keep it to ourselves, but it's the way we go about sharing it. So in a Catholic school, you're already well placed because the environment is friendly to faith. At least I hope it is. It's supposed to be anyway. The environment is friendly to faith. So no one should be ashamed in a Catholic school to be known as a person who has some faith. And no Catholic school worth the name would be sort of minimising or pushing to the side or pretending it's all just marginal, the whole question of faith. So to create an environment where it's a question that can be discussed, a way of life that can be experienced, all of those sorts of things, but never imposing it on anybody else. I don't know if that helps or not. Maybe Dr. Sace or Bishop Dom want to add something. But I think be proud of your faith, recognise what a wonderful gift it is, be happy to share it, but never try and force it on anybody. Because God doesn't force it on anybody, and so we shouldn't either.
Obviously, I agree.
He has to, I'm the boss.
But I suppose what's always been helpful to me is to see other people who have gone through this whole process of coming to an understanding of the faith for themselves and have begun living according to what they believe, and I think that's sort of the way in which most of us learn the value of faith, when we see it working in the lives of other people. So I just support what's been said, but say it's looking around to see people who are really good models of Christian life, and then wondering, where do they get the courage and where do they get the strength to do the things that they do as Christians? You know, standing up for what they believe, for example. So, yeah.
I might just add one little thing. You know, every year on Holy Saturday night, so on Easter night, in all the parishes around the diocese and therefore also in the cathedral, we have a ceremony where older people, when I say older people, I mean not little babies, but teenagers, young adults, older adults, become Catholics. So they've made the decision at some stage or another that this is a community that they want to belong to. Every year in the cathedral, without fail, and I'm into my 8th year now as the Archbishop, every year there's a group of adults who are either parents whose kids go to a Catholic school or teachers who teach in a Catholic school who've decided to become Catholics because of what they've experienced in the school. And I don't think it would ever be because someone's beaten them into submission and said, you've got to become a Catholic or else. I think it's because they experience a genuine Catholic community and think, I'd really like to be a part of that. So I think the question's a really good one, and I suspect that already instinctively most of us know how to go about this, because your schools, our schools, are very attractive places of faith for lots of people. So I think we're already doing a really good job in proposing the faith by the way we live, rather than trying to impose it on people and forcing them into it. So.
Hi, my name's Mackenzie from LaSalle College.
Hi,
and
Mackenzie.
Our question is, what is the Australian Catholic Youth Festival about?
Okay, that's a great question. I'll say a few words and then Bishop Don might like to talk about it because he's kind of the key person organising it all for us. The Australian Catholic Youth Festival is an annual gathering every 2 years, Bishop Don, or every 3? Every 2. Every 2 years of young people from right across the country. And the origin of it was to sort of provide an alternative for those people who, for all sorts of reasons, weren't able to go to World Youth Day. So, you know, last year or earlier this year, World Youth Day was in Panama. Hardly anyone from Perth went, that whole set of reasons about that. But prior to that, it's been in places like Krakow in Poland and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Where's Rio de Janeiro? It's in Brazil, yes. So sort of those big, massive meetings of young people, Catholic young people. Sometimes I think Bishop Don and I were in the one in Brazil and there were 3 million young Catholics from around the world who came to that. They're a great experience. They're very expensive to get to. Not everyone can afford to do it. And so we wanted to do something to give people a similar experience, but a more accessible one. So in the intervening years between the World Youth Days, we have the Australian Catholic Youth Festival. Last time it was in Sydney. This time it's in Perth. It's a gathering of young people from around the ages of 15 or 16 up to, well, whatever you think still qualifies you as a young person. So generally we say the early 30s, don't we? So there'll be lots of people there. We're hoping to have between people from Perth and WA and people from around the country, about 5,000 or 6,000 young people who'll come together for 3 days. It's all going to be held at the Perth Exhibition Centre. Is that what it's called? A Convention and Exhibition Centre, just there on the river near Elizabeth Quay. And it's really an opportunity just to, in saying this, I think, gosh, it doesn't sound all that exciting. I wish I had a video to show you. It's a chance for people to come and, young people to come and experience the excitement and the energy and the enthusiasm of being a young Catholic in today's world. It's full of music, it's full of excitement, it's full of energy. There are all sorts of opportunities to explore issues of faith, not just in a forum like this where somebody who's got some authority or some leadership answers questions, but for young people together to explore issues of faith, whether they're, some of them could be quite challenging issues. There are big plenary sessions where everybody's together in a great big auditorium. We have lots of, I don't know how to, workshops. Yes, I was going to say in the big plenary meetings, there's sort of a lot of drama, there's a lot of music, there's a lot of singing, there's a lot of involvement. Then there are the workshops, there's opportunities for quiet times, for activities, all sorts of things. It's starting on Sunday, December the 8th, I think it is, and finishes on Tuesday, December the 10th, with a big, we hope at this stage, a big open air mass, which will be an extraordinary thing. Hopefully all of these thousands of young people, 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 young people will be there for the mass. We're going to have it in a venue where hopefully anybody else from Perth who wants to be part of it can come. Who knows how many people might come. So it's not just, as I say, it's not just where you come for 3 days and you sit at tables and you listen to people talk to you and you get to ask questions. There's a lot more energy and enthusiasm about it. Most of the people who go come away really enthusiastic. For some people, it can even be a life-changing experience. For lots of people, it's just 3 days of a really enjoyable time together. And it gives them a chance then to really, I guess, think about some of the questions I was trying to raise earlier about where do I stand in relation to this question of faith. So it's not just for those who are already deeply committed to their faith. It's not just for those who, it's for everybody. I guess that's what I'm saying. No matter where you happen to be in your own journey of faith, this is a chance for you to come, not to feel intimidated because you don't quite believe what the next person believes or anything like that. Chance for people to be together, to enjoy being together, to explore issues of faith, to have a good time. That's the Australian Catholic Youth Festival. But Bishop Don and maybe Dr. Sace, because Dr. Sace is also very heavily involved in this project, might say something about it.
The purpose, as we heard, was to give people in Australia that opportunity of having the same sort of experience if you were to go to World Youth Day. And I know from the experience of going to the one in Sydney, the Youth Festival in Sydney, it really is something that gives you a lift. And you come back really looking for further opportunities to listen to the witness of other people, to test that journey that you're undertaking within your own life by hearing the journeys of other people. And so we were very confident when we suggested that maybe Perth be the place for the next youth festival, that we'd get a good response. In fact, I can remember at the Mass at Sydney when Perth was announced, a big cheer went up. A lot of people want to come to Perth and they want to see us here in Perth, to be with us here in Perth, because we're, in a sense, a little younger, I suppose, in terms of the church. We've got a different sort of spirit, I think. And that's something that I think they guess, and that's what they're looking for. So I'm sure you who come and join us will be making a great impact on the young people who come across. We've got a great set of committees, and Peter Jentzsch is at the back there. He's the Deputy Director of Catholic Ed. There's Peter. Peter's got a wonderful committee called the Steering Committee that is really doing great work in the preparations for the festival. So thank you, Peter, for your work. But there are probably, I don't know how many other committees, but there's a whole bevy of committees that are helping the Steering Committee get everything organised. The Mass will be at Trinity College. We're very careful not to tread on the cricket pitch, but we're going to ensure that it's protected. But that'll be the oval that we'll be gathering everyone on. And we'll be doing a walk from the convention centre to the place where we're having the Mass at Trinity, which will be an opportunity for us, for everyone, to even think about the spirituality of Perth that is Christian, but also goes back thousands of years. So it'll be a way of us learning a bit more about the Aboriginal people and their spirituality. Recently, you might have heard that there's been a debate, or there is a debate, about whether we should use Aboriginal names, local Aboriginal names, giving them to our towns and cities, like Fremantle. That's really a way in which we, I think, can come to understand the stories around significant places that we ourselves call by different names. So that can be a part of that awakening of the work of the Spirit within us, seeing that the Spirit's been at work in people for thousands of years in this land, but we've come in order to bring the good news of Jesus Christ to these people too. And that's a work that continues today. So the festival has, I think, that very important mission to help us grow in faith and help us learn how to share that faith with other people.
And I've... Not working?
Yeah.
Is it working?
Yeah.
There we go. So, I'd just like to add, our theme is listen to what the Spirit is saying. And as Archbishop spoke earlier, and Bishop Don and I cited it as well, God is alive, Jesus is alive, and young people have that voice in order to engage. So the experience of Youth Festival, and I too went to the one in Sydney, and it went from early morning to late at night, and you're exhausted at the end of it, but it was such an uplifting experience. Loud music, contemplative quiet times, prayer life, engagement for people around Australia. It was extraordinary. So I encourage you, particularly our Year 12s who would have finished school by then, you can register as a free citizen, but for our schools to get heavily involved and for our young staff in our schools to encourage them to attend as well. It's an extraordinary event of gathering, of prayer, of being Catholic today. And I think, and Archbishop, I'll cite you, sometimes the Eastern States tends to think, what does Western Australia know? Well, Western Australia has a very loud voice, a very engaging voice, one of strong faith, and we really want to demonstrate and show our faith to our friends from the other states and territories. Is that right?
Absolutely. I just might add too that, you go to these things and it's a little bit like the announcement for where the next Olympic Games is going to be held. There'd been a fair bit of encouragement, if I can put it that way, for me to agree to have the Youth Festival in Perth this year. And I was a little bit iffy about it, I must say, because it's a big thing. And I'm thinking to myself, can we pull it off or can't we? But as the Sydney Youth Festival went by, and I still hadn't made up my mind finally, and Archbishop Fisher, who was the Archbishop of Sydney, was saying to me, look, Tim, we really want to be able to announce where the next one's going to be. So the pressure was really on. And anyway, I talked to a lot of people. I spoke to Dr. Sayce and to Bishop Don and lots of other people, and I got the sense that if we decided to do it, that the church in Perth, and particularly the younger part of the church in Perth, would really get behind it. So I said yes, and I remember at the end of the Mass, just before the final blessing, I had to go up to the microphone, and Archbishop Fisher is doing his imitation of the president of the International Olympic Committee and saying, the next youth festival will be in, and everybody's waiting to hear what it is. And then he said Perth, and everybody started yelling and screaming. And I thought, well, if that's an indication of how enthusiastic the Perth people are, then yes, we can pull it off. But we really do need to rely on the energy of our young people to make it a success, because as both Bishop Don and Dr. Sayce have said, people in the eastern states, I used to be one of them, I'm not anymore, people in the eastern states sometimes wonder what's going on the other side of the Nullarbor, and is the church actually there at all? And is it alive, and what's it up to? And we really want to show the rest of Australia that we have something special about the church here in Perth. And I think we do have something special. We're able to do things here that people on the other side of the country don't do, because we're a little bit isolated, we're a little bit independent, we can do our own thing a bit. And so I'm really enthusiastic about it, I'm really confident about it, but I'm really hoping that you'll get behind it. And that the schools will get behind it. It will be a great way to finish off the year. For those who are still at school, and also for those in Year 12 and maybe some in Year 11, I'm not sure when the Year 11s finish, but who might be right at the end of the school year. But to be able to come together for 3 days, showcase the church in Perth to the rest of the country, I think that'll be a great thing. So I'm really looking forward to it. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Ruby from Santa Maria College.
Hi, Ruby.
When babies die before being born, when they're stillborns and have not been baptised, will they go straight to heaven?
Okay. Good question. And maybe I'm happy to answer it, but again, Bishop Don or Dr. Sace might want to say something about it. I think the question comes out of the idea that in order to get to heaven, you've got to be baptised. And therefore, if anybody, I suppose, dies before they're baptised, and therefore particularly children before their birth who are still in their mother's womb and maybe are stillborn, die, or die during childbirth or something like that, will they still go to heaven? I think the simple answer is yes. When I was a kid at school, we used to get taught a lot about a thing called limbo. Anyone ever heard of limbo before? Not too many of you. So this will come as a bit of a surprise to most of you. But when I was a little boy going to school, we were taught that there were kind of 4 options after you died. The best option was heaven. The worst option was hell. The second best option was purgatory. And then the third best option, or second worst option, if you like, was limbo. Now, the idea was that you could only go to heaven if you were baptised, but if you weren't baptised but you hadn't ever done anything wrong, it didn't seem fair that God would send you to hell, so there had to be somewhere else. And so they came up with this theory. And that's all it ever was, a theory, but some people thought it was official church teaching. It never was. They came up with this theory that there was this option of a place where you could be naturally happy after you died, rather than supernaturally happy, which would mean in heaven with God. And so if you hadn't been lucky enough to get baptised, or you'd never heard about Jesus or something like that, and you died and you'd lived a good life, or you hadn't even lived long enough to be able to live a bad life, you could go to limbo. When you think it through, it doesn't really make sense, because there's something in the Bible that says God wants everybody to be saved. That's what God wants. Now, I spoke earlier about faith and the gift of faith, and so salvation, finally reaching our ultimate destiny in heaven with God, is a free choice that we make over the course of our lifetime. God's not going to force anybody in through the gates of heaven. If you're absolutely determined not to go there, well, that's your choice and God will respect it. But that's got to be a choice. And if you're too young to make the choice, then how could God exclude you from heaven? So, because God wants everybody to be saved, and because not everybody has the chance to be baptised, for those who've never had the chance to be baptised, there has to be another way of salvation, of going to heaven, and that's what the church teaches. So the old idea that there was this other place that unbaptised babies might go to after they died, that's not any longer a part of the church's understanding. Does that sort of answer the question? Yeah, it's a really good question, because of course, lots of children die before they're born, lots of children die in childbirth, lots of children die when they're still very young, but for some reason their parents haven't had them baptised. Once upon a time, people believed that none of those people could go to heaven and be with God. But as we've come to understand God and God's love better, we realise that just doesn't make any sense. So the only people who, in theory, never get to heaven are those who've lived a life in which they've made it clear that they will not be open to God's presence in their lives at all. I don't think there are many people like that, to tell you the truth. It's always possible. So just hang on to this. In the Bible, in the scriptures, it says God wants everybody to be saved. If that's what God wants, then unless you decide you don't want it, that's what will be your future. Yeah. Is that right, or?
I think I'd give you 100% for that answer.
Hi.
Hi, my name's Yasmin Brown and I'm from Aramal Catholic College. And some of us are studying the contemporary issue of euthanasia in our religion class.
Mm-hmm.
We were wondering so how the church's response to euthanasia causes tension and conflict.
That's a very important question, and it's a very current question, as you all know, at the moment. I was in Sydney for meetings and only got back to Perth on Wednesday night of last week, and I woke up on Thursday morning to find that the government had made the announcement that it was pursuing legislation to legalise euthanasia. I want to preface my remarks with what I said in relationship to the first question, and that is that for me as the Archbishop, but I think for the role of the Church generally, our task is to propose what we believe, but not impose. So I, as the Archbishop, can't force the government to do anything. I can't force anybody to do anything. But what I can do is present the Church's understanding. And the teaching of the Catholic Church, and this is a question of faith. You know, we live in a society where we have lots of different faiths, and we live in a society where lots of people would claim not to have any faith, certainly not any faith in a God. So this is a question of faith that I'm talking about, and it is the firm belief of the Catholic tradition that life, from its very beginning, is a gift from God, and only God has the right to decide when a life should end. And so, in one sense, the issue's very simple, but in saying that, I don't want to pretend that it's not a very agonising decision for a lot of people. But from a point of view of faith, we believe God is the giver of life, the creator of life, and that every moment of life, no matter how difficult it might be, is a moment where God's gift needs to be respected. So basically, the Church's position would be that no one has the right to take another person's life because that is God's domain, if you like. We need to add, though, that, and you may or may not agree with this, but I think that for a lot of people, they don't understand the difference between euthanasia and very good palliative care for people who are dying. And so one of the problems with euthanasia is that it provides society with, if you like, this sounds a bit hard, I don't mean it to be, but with a quick and simple solution, which is not going to cost society too much money. Palliative care is a very expensive thing. You need lots of doctors and nurses who are going to be there to care for people as they journey through this last stage of their life. The Catholic Church's view would be that the fundamental value of every human life is such that providing the resources for good palliative care is actually one of the most fundamental responsibilities of any society, not an optional extra. So we would be arguing for a much greater commitment to providing universal, good quality palliative care for those who are reaching the end of their life, rather than to say, well, we will allow people either to take their own life or to get someone else to do it for them. But in the end, it comes down to a fundamental principle. Is life of such great value that no one has the right to take another person's life or not? That's the bottom line. And I think for us, certainly for me, thinking about this, once society crosses that line and says, well, there are times when it is possible to take another person's life, then you've kind of opened the gates to someone further down the line saying, well, here's another set of conditions where it's okay to take someone's life. So it's one of those sort of fundamental principles that certainly we in the Catholic Church would say needs to be maintained for the welfare of society as a whole. So that's how I would understand it. But all we can do is put forward our point of view, argue as persuasively as we can, and hope that our point of view might be seen for what it is. Difficult issue all the same.
I'm Talia Johnson from Emmanuel Catholic College, and my question is, has there ever been a time where your faith has been challenged, and if so, what brought you back to faith?
Yes, well, I'm happy to answer that, and then the others might want to have a go. It really relates to the last question. My mother died when I was a young priest overseas studying. And I was called back quite suddenly and told that I needed to get back quickly because otherwise my mother will have died before I could get home. I've never told anyone much this story before, but so I came home, and at the time that my mother was in one hospital dying, she had a very, very bad and painful form of cancer. My sister-in-law was in another hospital due to give birth to her first and, as it turns out, only child. And because of her health issues, it was going to be a caesarean operation. So we knew exactly when the baby was going to be born. So I was in one hospital with my mother, and my brother was in another hospital with his wife. And as it turned out, the baby was born the same day that my mum died. And I remember not knowing what to do with myself. What are you supposed to do? And every year, and it's only just last month, every year the anniversary comes around, and you don't know what to do. Do I feel sad because of the anniversary of Mum's death, or happy because it's the birthday of my niece, who's now 28? And trying to work with that and understand what God was doing and why this was happening was a really difficult time for me. And I remember going, after everything was over and we'd had the funeral and I'd also baptised my new niece, I went back to Rome where I was studying, and I remember the people I was living with said, well, I wasn't Archbishop then. They said, Father Tim, wasn't that a beautiful thing? One life ended and another life began. And I thought to myself, there's nothing beautiful about it at all. I really got angry with people that they could sort of trivialise the whole thing with such a throwaway line, because it felt to me like it was a throwaway line which didn't respect what had actually happened. So that was a time when it wasn't so much my faith was challenged in the sense that I was going to walk away from everything, but I just couldn't understand it and I couldn't make sense of it, and I literally didn't know what to feel. But I'll tell you, and it relates to the earlier question, I was in hospital with Mum. She was very close to death, and in fact the doctors had said 2 days before, if you want anyone to say goodbye to your mother, you better get them now because she won't last the night. But she did. So I was in hospital with Mum. My brother was in hospital with his wife. The baby was born. He rang me to tell me and said, everything is okay, the baby's fine. Ronna, that's my sister-in-law's name, is fine. And they were in fact going to get my brother to bring the baby from one hospital to the other so that Mum would have the opportunity to, at least in some way or another, meet her one and only grandchild. But Mum was already very close to death. So I went into the room where Mum was, and I leaned over her and I just whispered to her, the baby's been born, it's a little girl, everything's okay, she's fine, Ronna's fine. And Mum couldn't talk anymore, she couldn't move. But a tear rolled down her face, and then within an hour she had died. And I think then that somehow or other God had given Mum the strength to hang on until we were able to tell her this news, and then she was able to go home to God. That's what kind of, thinking about it later, it was the presence of God in that very tragic situation, which kind of relates to that story I was talking about before with Peter walking on the water, you know. In the midst of a storm, and it was like being in the middle of a storm when all this was happening, I think I had a sense, and looking back I realised that the Lord was there saying, have courage, don't be afraid, I'm with you. And it's also why I worry about euthanasia, because if euthanasia had been a possibility and someone had pressured us, not that we would have done it, but nevertheless someone had pressured us into bringing Mum's death sooner than it needed to happen, she would have missed out on that very precious experience. So it just made me think, even when you can't see it, and even when it looks like a mess, and even when the whole thing looks like a bit of a disaster, really, God can still be there, still present, still working a way to bring good out of something terrible. So, yes, I wasn't expecting to tell that story this morning, but that's probably the thing that stands out in my mind when you ask me that question.